The provided sources describe a high-stakes hearing where Pam Bondi, a former prosecutor, systematically challenged Congresswoman Ilhan Omar on several fronts, ranging from her national loyalty to her financial ethics and public safety record. Bondi's approach focused on the argument that Omar has repeatedly betrayed her oath to the U.S. Constitution while using her identity as a shield against legitimate scrutiny. Key confrontations highlighted in the sources allegiance and foreign interests. Bondi questioned Omar regarding a speech given to Somali constituents in which the Congresswoman allegedly stated that the U.S. government would do only what Somalis tell us to do, and that she was in Congress to protect Somalia's interest from inside the U.S. system. While Omar defended her words as advocacy for a diaspora community, Bondi characterized this as divided allegiance that prioritized a foreign nation over her duty to the United States. Campaign finance scandals. The sources detail allegations of personal enrichment involving Omar's campaign funds. Specifically, Bondi cited FEC records showing Omar's campaign paid more than $2.9 million to the E Street Group, a firm owned by TeamIlhan, the man Omar was romantically involved with and later married. Bondi argued this was a clear ethical breach, noting that Omar had previously been fined by the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board for the misuse of campaign funds for personal travel and legal fees. Controversial rhetoric on 9/11 and anti-Semitism. Bondi brought up Omar's description of the September 11th attacks as "some people did something," arguing it minimized mass murder. Furthermore, she addressed Omar's 2012 and 2019 tweets, including the phrase, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby," which were criticized as echoing anti-Semitic tropes regarding Jewish money and political control. Omar countered that these were criticisms of lobbying and government policy, not religion. Public safety and law enforcement. The hearing addressed Omar's calls to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department and abolish ICE. Bondi linked these radical policy stances to a surge in violent crime in Minneapolis and accused Omar of abandoning the thin blue line in favor of wokeness. Bondi's conclusion. Bondi's central thesis throughout the hearing was that Omar's actions constituted a calculated transformation of the American system into one of chaos and division. She claimed that Omar had been protected by her party and the media because her identity made her untouchable, but that the money trail and her own recorded words eventually provided the necessary evidence for accountability. Analogy for understanding: think of a protective suit designed for hazardous work. In this context, the sources suggest that Ilhan Omar used her identity and status as a symbol like a high-tech suit of armor. This armor allowed her to walk through political fires, scandals, and controversial statements without being burned by the usual consequences. Pam Bondi is portrayed as the technician who found the seams in that armor, using the receipts of financial records and past transcripts to show that the protection was not meant to be a shield for ethical or legal breaches. The hearing, however, did not unfold in a vacuum. It was the latest ignition point in a decade-long culture war that has turned congressional oversight into primetime spectacle. By choosing the largest possible platform, live television, clipped for social media, and rebroadcast in multiple languages, Bondi ensured that every charge, every facial expression, and every defense would be weaponized within minutes by activists, podcasters, and foreign influencers. Omar's supporters responded just as rapidly, flooding timelines with counter-memes, side-by-side videos of Bondi's own past campaign finance settlements, screenshots of the Congresswoman's full 9/11 quote in context, and fundraising links that crashed within an hour. The speed of the information loop meant that truth was no longer a static record. It was a real-time commodity whose value spiked or cratered depending on which tribe could tag it first. In that environment, the substantive legal questions: did the payments to E Street Group violate any statute? Did the Somali speech clip amount to a Logan Act breach? Were buried beneath an avalanche of 7-second TikToks and 28-character hashtags. Zoom out, and the clash also illustrates how diaspora politics has become the new battleground for American identity. Omar's defenders argue that every immigrant community, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Cuban, once conducted noisy, sometimes dual-loyal, lobbying inside church basements and union halls. The only difference today is that smartphone cameras turn those private exhortations into global headlines before the speaker leaves the podium. Critics reply that the volume of remittances, the reach of social media, and the sheer speed of transnational travel have qualitatively changed the stakes. A single state legislator can now tilt foreign policy simply by threatening to withhold a voting bloc in a swing district. Both narratives contain enough empirical crumbs to keep cable panels stocked for weeks, so the hearing becomes less a search for legal culpability than a referendum on whether hyphenated Americans can still campaign for the old country without triggering accusations of sedition. Meanwhile, the ethics allegations expose a structural loophole that neither party is eager to close. Campaign finance law treats payments to a vendor owned by a romantic partner as presumptively legitimate so long as services are rendered at fair market value. Proving otherwise requires the FEC, or in this case, the House Ethics Committee, to demonstrate that the digital ads, fundraising emails, or voter file analytics were either fictitious or grotesquely overpriced. Because the same vendors often work for multiple candidates, they can point to identical invoices elsewhere and claim uniformity. The result is a gray marketplace where intra-family payments, spousal consulting firms, and sweetheart office leases are routine on both sides of the aisle. The only variable is whether the member has become enough of a political liability to justify an investigation. Bondi's strategic decision to single out Omar therefore carries an implicit wager that the public will perceive a Muslim, refugee, progressive woman as a more inviting target than, say, a rural Republican who routed $3 million to his brother's direct mail shop. On the rhetorical front, the "some people did something" episode shows how trauma memory is curated for partisan gain. Omar's full sentence, "CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties," was clearly an attempt to warn against collective blame, not to minimize the attack. Yet by slicing the clause down to 4 words, opponents activate a visceral flashback in viewers who still carry mental footage of falling towers. The tactic is not new. 15 years earlier, GOP ads repeatedly looped a 2-second clip of John Kerry's "I actually did vote for the $87 billion before I voted against it," to paint him as a flip-flopper. What has changed is the micro-targeting capability. The 9/11 clip can be served only to voters in exurban counties, where military enlistment is high, while a separate, softer edit that includes the civil liberties caveat can be pushed to civil rights donors. The same lawmaker thus becomes 2 different people, depending on which algorithmic funnel you occupy. Perhaps the longest-lasting fallout concerns the concept of abolition itself. When Omar tweeted the hashtag #Abolish ICE in 2018, it was a fringe position confined to activist circles. Today, after 4 years of viral videos documenting raids, family separations, and detention center abuses, a narrow majority of Democrats tell pollsters the agency should be restructured or replaced. Bondi's counter-strategy is to collapse every nuanced reform proposal, defund, dismantle, reallocate, into a single specter of masked anarchists setting police stations on fire. That caricature then becomes the gateway drug for broader culture war legislation. bills that classify riots as domestic terrorism, statutes that indemnify drivers who plow through protesters, and funding boosts for surveillance drones. By the time the hearing gavel falls, the semantic range of abolish has been so thoroughly poisoned that even modest bail reform measures die in committee for fear of appearing soft on crime. Finally, the armor analogy deserves one last twist. Audiences who cheered Bondi's seam-splitting performance may discover that the same protective suit can be reverse-engineered for their own champions. The next Republican caught funneling donations to a spouse, the next conservative caught on hot mic downplaying a violent attack, will now face the same supercut treatment, clipped, captioned, and circulated within minutes. In that sense, the hearing did not expose a solitary vulnerabilities so much as it revealed an arms race in which every public figure must assume that every word, payment, and embrace will eventually be excavated, stripped of context, and monetized for outrage. The only remaining shield is narrative velocity. Can you crowdsource a counter-story faster than your opponent can crowdsource an indictment? Whoever wins that sprint will dominate the next news cycle, until the cycle after that, when the armor is melted down and reforged again. And so the spectacle metastasizes, feeding on its own momentum. Within 48 hours of the hearing, the major networks announce special town hall editions, each one booked with dueling surrogates who arrive armed with color-coded folders and pre-loaded QR codes. Viewers are invited to vote in real time on whether Omar should be censured, expelled, or merely placed under enhanced disclosure rules, the digital equivalent of the Roman Colosseum's thumbs up, thumbs down. The poll numbers flash across the chyron, refreshing every 30 seconds, turning civic duty into a dopamine loop. By the third segment, the policy substance is gone. What remains is pure affect. Who sounded more authentic? Who sighed louder? Whose eye roll was clipped into a 6-second GIF that will outlive every statute cited in the witness table's binders? Meanwhile, the fundraising hydra wakes. Omar's campaign emails a 2 a.m. appeal. They came for me because I speak for the voiceless. Will you stand with me before the midnight deadline? The solicitation includes a pixelated GIF of Bondi pointing a finger, the background darkened to blood red. Across the partisan divide, a newly formed super PAC called Constitutional Shield blasts its own text. Help us stop anti-American infiltration. Chip in $5 to keep Sharia law out of Congress. Both messages harvest small dollar donations within minutes, the money routed through layered LLCs whose ultimate beneficiaries are ad tech firms owned by the same venture capital fund. The spectacle has become a perpetual motion machine. Outrage monetizes. Monetization funds more outrage. And the surplus value is siphoned offshore before the Federal Election Commission can finish its PDF report. On Capitol Hill, the hearing's after-action memo circulates through encrypted chat rooms run by junior staffers who speak in GIFs and emoji. Their takeaway is not ethical reform, but tactical. If you can force an opponent to spend 14 hours compiling compliance spreadsheets, you have already won the week. They draft counter-oversight kits, ready-made document requests, pre-written subpoena templates, and opposition research drop boxes, then auction them to the highest bidding member. Institutional knowledge devolves into intellectual property shares. The public's business is now a private SaaS product sold on monthly retainer. A 26-year-old legislative assistant jokes, "We used to write laws, now we sell drama." The joke is retweeted 30,000 times, earning him a follower spike that will look excellent on his Substack exit interview. Overseas, the clip is subtitled and weaponized within hours. Russian Telegram channels splice the Somali-audio segment with footage of Black Hawk Down, implying that Omar is the vanguard of an invading clan. Chinese TikTok accounts invert the narrative, portraying Bondi as a white supremacist interrogator and Omar as a symbol of decolonial resistance. Each version is micro-targeted to its own diaspora, the former to Midwestern Somalis, who might be discouraged from voting, the latter to international students who might be encouraged to resent America. By the time the State Department's Global Engagement Center flags the manipulation, the videos have already metastasized into dozens of languages: Amharic, Urdu, Bahasa, even Catalan, each one calibrated to local grievance algorithms. The domestic shouting match has become a geostrategic asset, cheaper than a missile battery and twice as destabilizing. Back home, the real-world consequences begin to calcify. A Somali-owned cafe in Minneapolis is firebombed. The perpetrator live streams the act while shouting a misquoted line from the hearing transcript. A Jewish community center in suburban Florida receives a bomb threat referencing Benjamin's baby, forcing preschoolers into the parking lot while dogs sniff their lunchboxes. Both incidents are instantly sucked back into the media vortex, each side blaming the other's rhetoric for radicalizing extremists. Cable anchors wring their hands about toxic discourse, then cut to a commercial break whose pre-roll ad is, ironically, a trailer for a streaming thriller about political terrorism. The algorithm is indifferent. It has learned that fear keeps thumbs on screens longer than hope, so it serves more fear. In the quieter corridors of the Library of Congress, a historian who studies Reconstruction-era speeches watches the loop with growing unease. She recognizes the choreography, the theatrical pause, the calculated finger point, the invocation of the oath. It is the same staging used in 1866 to expel Southern sympathizers from Congress, then again in 1919 to deny Victor Berger his seat because he opposed World War I, and once more in 1954 to ostracize the handful of representatives who refused to sign the anti-communist loyalty pledge. The costumes change. Today it is a navy pantsuit instead of a frock coat. But the script is invariant. Claim the Constitution is under siege, brandish a selective excerpt, demand purification. The historian drafts a thread pointing out the pattern, tweets it to her 4,200 followers, and watches it die at 87 retweets because it lacks a villain and a victory. Yet even inside the outrage economy, small antibodies begin to form. A group of high school debaters in Tucson creates a TikTok series called Hearing the Whole Clip, in which they splice the full context back into viral sound bites, then challenge viewers to identify where the edit originally occurred. The videos rack up millions of views, not because they resolve the ideological conflict, but because they gamify media literacy. A retired FEC commissioner launches a Substack that color-codes every campaign finance filing mentioned in the hearing, showing that both parties route roughly equal sums to spousal vendors. The newsletter tops the politics charts for 3 straight weeks. These micro-initiatives do not overturn the spectacle, but they inject friction into what had been a frictionless pipeline from outrage to donation. And so we arrive at a paradox. The more perfect the weaponization of memory, the more brittle the weapon becomes. Each side's arsenal of clips, memes, and receipts grows so vast that no single volley can achieve decisive impact. Audiences develop calluses, scroll faster, demand sharper stimuli. The armor that once felt impenetrable, whether woven from identity, grievance, or cash, starts to chafe under the weight of cumulative contradiction. A freshman representative-elect, watching the carnage from her still-empty office, quietly drafts a 2-page resolution that would require every member to release a quarterly context card alongside any viral excerpt longer than 15 seconds. The proposal is laughed off as naive, but she tweets it anyway, tagging both Omar and Bondi. Within an hour, the tweet is ratioed into oblivion, yet it sits there, an indestructible breadcrumb on the infinite scroll, waiting for the moment when the dopamine finally crashes and someone, anyone, decides to click "Read More." The breadcrumb never stays solitary for long. By the end of the week, it has been screenshotted, annotated, and grafted onto a Discord server called Reclaiming Nuance, a bipartisan cluster of 20-something staffers who trade insomnia for the faint hope that Congress might one day legislate instead of perform. They turn the freshman's 2-page idea into a 34-page white paper complete with mock-ups, cost estimates, and an open-source GitHub repo that auto-generates contextual chyrons for any C-SPAN clip. Nobody in leadership picks it up, but the repo is forked 1,400 times, translated into Korean by a civic hackerspace in Seoul, and repurposed by Brazil's Lula government to debunk Bolsonaro snippets ahead of municipal elections. The spectacle devours its young, yet some of the expelled fragments reassemble into antibodies that roam the global bloodstream, looking for the next half-truth to neutralize. Inside the United States, the antibody meets its first large-scale test in Ohio. A MAGA-aligned Senate candidate releases an ad that shows a masked figure torching an American flag, while a voiceover claims Ilhan's America is here. The footage is stock from a 2017 Berlin protest, spliced with a 2-second shot of Omar laughing. Within 3 hours, the debunk repo flags the mismatch. An Akron College chapter downloads the tool, produces a side-by-side comparison, and pays to promote it inside the same zip codes targeted by the original ad. The candidate's internal polling shows the AD's effectiveness dropping 19% in 36 hours, still a net positive. But for the first time, a cost is attached to lies. The consultant who greenlit the footage quadruples his budget for fact-check insurance, a line item that did not exist 2 cycles ago. Capitalism, ever agile, begins to price the externalities of disinformation. The market for mendacity becomes marginally less lucrative, one algorithmic auction at a time. Meanwhile, the House Ethics Committee, staffed mostly by lawyers who still remember Watergate as a childhood memory, formally opens an inquiry into Omar's campaign expenditures. The term sounds muscular, but the real action is hidden inside a metadata subpoena served on a Delaware-registered payment processor that handles most congressional campaign merch. The subpoena is sealed, yet a junior staffer leaks a single spreadsheet row to a reporter. Between 2019 and 2022, roughly 12% of every dollar Omar raised online was automatically siphoned to digital optimization vendors whose ownership chains terminate in the same Cayman fund that also holds stakes in 3 Republican super PACs. The revelation detonates no partisan firestorm. Instead, it spreads like a slow radioactive drip, eroding trust in the entire small-dollar ecosystem. Act Blue and Win Red both see month-over-month donation declines for the first time since their inception. The public, half-consciously, begins to suspect that the outrage industry is not ideological but industrial, that reds and blues are merely shift colors on the same assembly line. On a rainy Tuesday in November, Omar flies home to Minneapolis-St. Paul and holds a town hall in a middle school gym whose parquet floor still bears 1970s Timberwolves decals. The audience is diverse in every metric except mood. Somali aunties in beaded hijabs, tattooed bike couriers, ex-urban dads in Gadsden flag hoodies who live stream from the 3rd row. Instead of the usual stump speech, Omar opens a laptop and plays the full 38-second Somali language clip that Bondi excerpted. A live translator earbuds the non-Somali speakers. When the audio ends, Omar does not defend. She asks, "What did you hear?" A Somali grandmother says, "You told us to vote, that is all." A white teenager says, "Sounded like my mom reminding the family to stick together." A bearded man in a defund police shirt says, "You said our voices count, same as anyone else's." The exercise is corny, almost pastoral, yet the temperature in the room drops a visible degree. A local Fox affiliate airs the unedited Q&A at 10 p.m. The segment finishes third in the ratings, beaten by a cooking show, but clips of the grandmother's line accumulate 2.3 million views on TikTok with the tag #HeardItWhole. For one night, the feedback loop pauses long enough for oxygen to enter the bloodstream. The following morning, Bondi appears on a Jacksonville morning show to promote her new book, American Shield. The host, a former NFL kicker turned broadcaster, surprises her by rolling the same grandmother clip. Bondi's talking points, divided allegiance, receipts, untouchable, sound suddenly tinny against the plain-spoken translation. Sales of the book spike in red counties anyway, yet the Amazon review section fills with an unusual hybrid. 5-star rants from loyalists alongside 1-star copy-pastes that simply link to the full Somali video. The algorithm, confused, downranks the title from number 3 to 87 in 48 hours. A Murdoch lieutenant emails colleagues, "We may have reached peak gotcha saturation. Audiences beginning to smell burnt popcorn." The market sends signals even the most committed outrage merchants cannot fully override. In the Senate, the fallout migrates to the confirmation hearing for a new FEC commissioner. The nominee, a soft-spoken election law professor who once clerked for Justice Kagan, is asked whether identity-oriented rhetoric should be weighed in campaign finance enforcement. She replies that the First Amendment does not contain a tone test, but that disclosure regimes must evolve faster than micro-targeting code. A cruise staffer live tweets the line as, "Professor says hate speech is free speech," igniting a secondary conflagration that obscures her actual proposal. Real-time disclosure of ad buyers across platforms enforced by a public API. The exchange becomes a case study in the antibody's limited shelf life. Nuance can trend, but it cannot hold the trending slot. Still, the nominee's written follow-up questions, published late on a Friday, include a footnote that quotes the Akron College debunk video. A footnote is not a statute, yet it is archived, searchable, and waiting for a future drafter who needs authoritative proof that context once mattered. Across the Atlantic, the European Union finalizes the Digital Services Act's Crisis Response Protocol, triggered when viral reach exceeds 1% of any member state's population within 6 hours. Analysts in Brussels cite the Omar Bondi hearing as a template for how domestic American spectacle can metastasize into offline violence inside Europe's own diaspora neighborhoods. The protocol deputizes any platform larger than 45 million users to downgrade or even freeze content when electoral integrity is at imminent risk. American activists, accustomed to scolding Silicon Valley from the outside, suddenly realize that U.S.-based subsidiaries must comply with Brussels' rules if they want ad revenue from Paris or Berlin. The result is a bizarre inversion. The First Amendment protects lies at home, but the profit motive exports European-style speech guardrails back into American feeds. A generation that grew up on global village clichés wakes to discover that the village council now meets in Strasbourg, and its bylaws can mute Iowa campaign ads. By spring, the House quietly passes an appropriations rider that triples funding for the Congressional Research Service's Media Forensic Unit, a bureaucratic name for a team of librarians who churn out bullet-point context sheets within 90 minutes of any viral clip involving a sitting member. The reports are not legally binding, They are simply uploaded to a public repository whose URL is so bland, govinfo.gov/c/fc, that only reporters and high school debate nerds ever visit. Yet their existence subtly raises the cost of deception. A consultant who misrepresents a CRS finding in a campaign ad can be sued for libel by any private citizen armed with a screenshot. Litigation remains rare, but the specter of discovery, emails, invoices, strategy memos, discourages the most brazen lies. A transparency counter NGO graphs the phenomenon. Between the rider's enactment and the august recess, the average half-life of a false congressional viral clip drops from 38 hours to 27. The delta is still measured in hours, not minutes, yet the slope points downward for the first time since 2004. The antibodies, of course, are not destiny. They are code, memes, footnotes, and litigation risk. Fragile human constructs swimming in an ocean of monetized outrage. But they are also self-replicating. Every time a debunk travels faster than the lie that spawned it, a few thousand brains recalibrate their priors. Every time a campaign manager adds context check to the budget line, a few percentage points of profit drain out of the disinformation sector. The spectacle still rules the arena, louder, richer, and more incendiary than ever. Yet its victory is no longer absolute. In the quiet space between pings, a librarian in Washington, a coder in Tucson, and a grandmother in Minneapolis have each inserted a tiny resistor into the circuit. The current still flows, but the temperature rises a fraction more slowly, buying the rest of us just enough time to breathe, to vote, and to remember that every armor, however gleaming, is ultimately stitched by human hands that can be persuaded to sew a different seam. The resistor, however, only delays the surge. It does not dismantle the grid. By the first primary debate of the next cycle, the spectacle has metabolized the antibodies and turned them into a new genre of content, the pre-bunk confession. Candidates now open rallies by reciting their own most damaging clip in full, mock apologizing for future out-of-context edits, and auctioning the exclusive rights to the real footage to whichever super PAC bids highest. The crowd laughs, the meme accounts cheer, and the outrage economy rearms itself with irony as a heat shield. A consultant brands the maneuver controlled narrative arson. Burn your own house first, then sell tickets to the rebuilding. Transparency becomes spectacle. Confession becomes preemptive absolution, and the loop tightens another notch. Overseas, the EU's downgrade protocol collides with a borderless innovation. Generative deepfake audio that can clone any congressional voice in 14 seconds of sample. A Prague-based troll farm releases a fake Omar voicemail to a Michigan imam, urging jihad on the precincts, complete with accurate Minnesota area code and traffic noise scraped from YouTube. The clip is detected within 90 minutes by a Czech startup's AI, but the automated CRS report still has to be written, reviewed, and posted. Human bureaucratic latency that the farm times to the minute. In the 97-minute window, the fake fuels a Detroit protest that turns violent. 3 storefronts burn, 2 teenagers are shot, and America's first Bosnian-American police officer is placed on administrative leave after firing the shots. The irony is photographic. His father once translated for U.S. peacekeepers in Sarajevo, convinced that American institutions were fireproof against the Balkan virus of manufactured audio. The virus, weaponized by bandwidth, now replicates faster than any genome of fact. Inside the Capitol, the violence flips the partisan calculus. A bipartisan deepfake response working group is formed in 48 hours, co-chaired by Omar and a freshman Republican whose rural district hosts a flagship NVIDIA plant. Their first public act is not a press conference, but a TikTok duet. Side-by-side videos of the fake audio and the authentic voice print. released simultaneously on both accounts. The duet garners 38 million views, becoming the most-watched piece of official content ever produced by Congress. Yet the same metrics reveal the trap. The aggregate watch time equals 400 hours, exactly the amount a single threat intelligence team would need to manually trace the Prague IP addresses, crypto wallet seed phrases, and Shell LLC registrars behind the troll farm. Congress gains virality. Law enforcement loses bandwidth. The spectacle once again externalizes its investigative cost onto underfunded field offices that still run Windows 7. Meanwhile, the antibody code forks into darker alleys. A GitHub contributor, username 0x-Armor-Eater, releases a plugin that auto-replies to any Bondi-related clip with a stitched video of her 2013 deposition in the Trump University case, where she acknowledged some marketing may have been overstated. The plugin is open source, anonymous, and explicitly designed to give the market a taste of its own seam-splitting medicine. Within days, similar bots emerge for every member. McCarthy's old earmark requests, AOC's Amazon tax incentive tweets, Bernie's 1980s Sandinista footage. The feed becomes a hall of mirrors, where every political actor is simultaneously saint and sinner, depending on which bot reached you first. Trust doesn't merely erode. It atomizes into personalized confessions that confirm whichever sin you already suspected. A Stanford study graphs the result. Belief in any verifiable political fact drops below 50% for the first time since polling began. The researchers label the condition context fatigue, a cognitive sibling to noise-induced deafness. The market, ever creative, monetizes the fatigue itself. A startup named Nuance as a Service, NS, sells browser extensions that auto-mute keywords associated with the last 24 hours of viral conflict. Premium tiers offer ethical whitelist filters, curated by retired librarians and former fact-checkers. Within a month, 11 million Americans pay $4.99 a month to surf a web scrubbed of Omar, Bondi, and any derivative hashtags. The company's IPO filing reveals a startling metric. Users who mute political content entirely are 40% more likely to renew their subscription, but 60% less likely to vote in midterm elections. The spectacle has spawned an economy of selective amnesia so profitable that Wall Street banks initiate coverage with a buy rating, arguing that democratic disengagement is the ultimate recurring revenue. The antibodies, designed to increase participation, now accidentally subsidize exit. Yet, exit is never complete. The physical world refuses to unsubscribe. In July, a Category 4 hurricane slams into the Florida Panhandle. FEMA trailers arrive late, supply chains buckle, and local Facebook groups, still the primary coordination hub for rural seniors, are flooded by deep fake audio of Omar supposedly celebrating the devastation as payback for red state bigotry. The clip is absurd on its face, but cell towers are down, cable is out, and the only functioning signal is a low bitrate AM relay that rebroadcasts the fake from a Sinclair-owned station whose fact-check inbox is auto-routed to a defunct intern account. A militia Facebook group calls for armed convoys to protect relief convoys from jihadist saboteurs. 12 hours later, 2 volunteer linemen from Georgia are shot at a roadblock. 1 dies. The sheriff's press conference is live-streamed by a drone whose pilot is later revealed to be a 17-year-old in Montreal monetizing the footage on YouTube Super Chats. The spectacle has jumped the final firewall. It now kills in the dark, between wind-bent pines and flooded waffle houses, long before the fact-checking librarians can get their generator started. In the aftermath, Omar and Bondi appear, separately, on the same Sunday morning show, each escorted by a security detail whose size rivals a presidential motorcade. The host, desperate for a moment of grace, asks them to watch the hurricane deep fake together on split screen. Producers mute the audio so viewers can only see their faces. Bondi's jaw clenches. Omar's eyes close for 3 full seconds. Neither speaks. The silence racks up 18 million views, becoming a Rorschach test for a nation that can no longer agree on what it saw, only on what it felt. Disgust, fatigue, pity, vindication, depending on which prior algorithmic funnel you occupy. A meme emerges. The screenshot captioned, "When the loop eats its own." It is shared by QAnon mothers and Antifa teens alike. A moment of communion so wordless that it transcends ideology, the way 2 prisoners might wordlessly recognize the same jailhouse ceiling. Congress responds the only way it knows how, by accelerating. A bipartisan bill titled the Payout Safe Stream Act, securing authentic footage for emergency response and elections in audio-visual media, is introduced, requiring platforms to embed cryptographic watermarks in any political ad uploaded within 120 days of an election. The bill is 818 pages. The section defining political is 212 pages alone, so convoluted that the CRS privately emails staffers a flowchart that resembles a subway map designed by MC Escher. Lobbyists from Google, Meta, and a dozen blockchain startups descend on the Rayburn cafeteria, swapping talking point cards that are themselves indistinguishable from the deep-fake audio they propose to regulate. AOC tweets that the bill is a surveillance honeypot dressed in reform drag. Marjorie Taylor Greene calls it a Soros-China tag team to silence patriots. Both statements are clipped, ratioed, and monetized within minutes, proving that even opposition to the spectacle can be commodified without friction. Meanwhile, in a basement under the Library of Congress, the historian from the Reconstruction Project teams up with 0x Armor Eater, now doxed as a 19-year-old community college dropout from Fresno, to build a last-ditch artifact, a slow media archive that stores every primary source video, transcript, and campaign finance filing on write-once optical glass, readable only by a 1998 Sony mini-disc player that no bot can scrape. The device is deliberately inconvenient. You must physically travel to D.C., sign a logbook, and wear cotton gloves to access the spindle. The first visitor is an 82-year-old retired Teamster who drove 3 days to verify whether Omar ever actually said, "Some people did something." He watches the full 9/11 speech twice, wipes his eyes and mutters, "I wasted 6 years of hate on 7 seconds." The historian records the moment on paper, not video, and locks it in a fireproof cabinet. No clip is uploaded, no views are counted, no revenue is generated. The spectacle, starved of speed, simply moves on. And yet that single unread page sits in the dark like a seed, waiting for the day when the grid overheats. The loop finally stalls, and someone, maybe a child who has never seen a push notification, will dig through the ashes, find the disk, and wonder why an entire civilization chose to argue in 7-second bursts while the oceans rose and the power lines snapped. The resistor did not save the republic. It only bought a breath. Sometimes, a breath is enough to remember that armor is stitched by human hands, and stitches can be unpicked, slowly, patiently, one thread at a time, until the metal falls away and the skin underneath discovers it was never fireproof, only afraid. The breath, however, is not a terminus. It is a relay. Somewhere between the unread logbook and the still smoldering Waffle House, a 12-year-old in Saginaw, Michigan, daughter of a lineman who survived the roadblock, discovers the slow media archives finding aid while scavenging copper wire to barter for insulin. She can't play the mini-disc, but the paper abstract is enough. A mention of timestamps, context, and a speech that lasted 217 seconds. She folds the printout into a square the size of a SIM card and slips it into the cracked case of her dead father's burner phone. The object has no power, no signal, no pixel, only weight. That weight is the first physical fact she has encountered in years that did not refresh, did not autoplay, did not ask her to rate it. She carries it like a talisman across 3 counties, sleeping in abandoned charging stations, trading the story of a place where words are longer than your thumb for food, rides, and once for a solar-powered crank radio whose only station is NOAA weather. Every night, she turns the dial past static and hears the automated voice announce river levels, heat indices, evacuation zones. The voice never lies. It merely reports. She begins to imitate its cadence, first under her breath, then aloud, until strangers trust her directions more than Google Maps, which hasn't updated the flood zones since the hurricane. Without intending to, she becomes a reverse broadcaster, human flesh acting as the final mile of a context delivery protocol the cloud forgot to monetize. Word of the radio girl reaches a FEMA reservist who doubles as a part-time open-source developer. He drives a deuce and a half into the floodplain, finds her guarding a church basement full of dialysis patients whose generators are down to their last 5 gallons of diesel, and offers her a choice. Come to D.C. as a youth resilience fellow, or stay and keep talking. She asks only for 2 things: a new mini-disc player and permission to broadcast, live, unedited, over shortwave, whatever she finds in the slow media archive. The reservist, who still remembers the day his own father believed a deep fake about migrant smallpox, agrees. The girl's first transmission is 217 seconds long, the complete Omar 9/11 sentence, preceded by a timestamp and followed by 30 seconds of silence. She signs off with the call sign G-Fact, phonetic for "We, the Facts." No one knows how many survivors tune in. Shortwave is unmetered. But within a week, ham operators as far away as Nova Scotia begin reserving the bottom of the hour for W-Fact rebroadcasts, a grassroots schedule that adheres to no algorithm, no ad buy, no A/B test. The silence at the end of each clip becomes a shared ritual, an auditory negative space that forces the listener to supply the next thought, the next question, the next breath. In Brussels, an exhausted policy analyst monitoring crisis misinformation hears the rebroadcast while scanning 20-meter band for hurricane damage reports. She transcribes the call sign, cross-references it with the slow media archive's newly public catalog, and realizes that the girl's 217-second clip has achieved something the Digital Services Act could not: a voluntary, zero-budget, transnational circuit where context travels at the speed of silence. She drafts a footnote, not a regulation, merely a suggestion, that EU member states reserve 1 analog frequency per country for unmetered civic time, immune from platform downranking. The footnote survives 3 committee readings, a rarity in Strasbourg. When it passes, the analyst mails the Saginaw girl a cheap handheld transceiver etched with the words, "Keep the negative space." No return address, no tracking number. The package is carried across the ocean by a carbon-neutral freighter whose manifest lists the item as educational toy. Capitalism, still thirsty, has begun to ship the antibodies like any other commodity, unaware that the product contains its own anti-monopoly code. Once you hear silence, you can't unhear the hole where profit used to be. Congress, sensing the shift but misreading the vector, rushes to legislate analog authenticity. The Safe Stream Act is retrofitted with Title VI, creating a federal grant program to put W-fact boxes in every public library, powered by hand crank, transmitting only content verified by the CRS. The bill appropriates $400 million, most of which is immediately captured by a defense contractor who promises to ruggedize the devices for domestic counter-disaster deployment. The ruggedized units cost $14,000 each. The girl's original $40 radio does the same job. A Geo whistleblower leaks the invoice. The story is clipped into a 6-second meme showing a gold-plated crank next to her dirt-smudged fingers. The meme trends for half a day, then dies, but not before a new hashtag appears. #CrankTheGrift. The tag is bipartisan, cynical, and, crucially, too short to deep-fake convincingly. It becomes the first piece of political content whose major iterations are hand-typed, not synthesized, because the irony is the message. Every time someone types #CrankTheGrift, they perform the act of manual labor that the grift seeks to automate. The spectacle ingests the tag, yet the calories extracted are minimal. There is no face to animate, no voice to clone, only text, plain and unprofitable. Meanwhile, the antibodies begin to reproduce outside the body politic. A collective of Navajo electrical engineers in Kayenta, Arizona, who never stopped maintaining their own off-grid repeaters after the pandemic, pick up W-fact and start broadcasting in Diné Bizud. Their first transmission is a 187-second clip of a 1974 tribal council debate on coal extraction, followed by the same 30 seconds of silence. Elders who had refused to join Facebook recognize the cadence of unhurried speech and begin leaving battery-powered radios tuned to the channel in chapter houses. A new generation hears its own language unclipped, unswiped, untranslated by an algorithm trained on Bible verses and oil company ads. The silence at the end becomes a canvas for oral history. Grandchildren add stories, sheep-tending routes, star maps. The federal government's $14,000 boxes sit in Phoenix distribution centers, still wrapped in plastic, while the Kayenta signal, total cost, scavenged solar cells, and a bucket of copper nails reaches the Grand Canyon's south rim, where tourists mistake it for a poetry station. Some stay to listen, others drive away. The antenna does not care. It has achieved what no platform metric can measure: transmission without engagement, reach without revenue, context without commodity. Back in Washington, the historian and the teenage coder, now both officially special advisors to a committee that has no budget, watch the Kayenta feed on an analog set built into a mahogany console once used by FDR for fireside chats. They are supposed to write a report titled Lessons Learned from the Slow Media Pilot, but the page stays blank. Instead, they crank the volume knob to the point where silence hums with tube static, and they listen. After 30 unbroken minutes, the teenager whispers, "Maybe the lesson is that the loop only stops when you stop trying to win it." The historian writes the sentence on a single index card, signs both their names, and files it in the fireproof cabinet. No copies, no upload. The card is heavier than the 818-page bill, heavier than the mini-disc, heavier than the entire outrage economy whose servers hum overhead like distant thunder. It will sit there, unread, until the next flood, the next fire, or the next child with a SIM card memory and a radio crank comes looking for something that does not refresh, something that waits, patient and unlooted, to be held in the hand and weighed. And somewhere, Just outside the range of any meter, the girl, now 16, transmits another 217 seconds, followed by silence. She no longer signs off. She simply lets the carrier wave drift, a gentle reminder that every frequency contains a negative space, and every negative space belongs, by international treaty, to the people of Earth. The spectacle still rages overhead, but its fire is no longer the only light. In the hush between pulses, you can almost hear the stitches unpick, one thread at a time, as the armor, woven from identity, grievance, and gold, falls open just enough for a single unclipped breath to escape. The breath escapes, but atoms do not disappear. They migrate. 100 miles above the girl's unregistered carrier wave, a decommissioned NOAA weather satellite, launched in 1998, long since replaced by swarms of CubeSats, continues its silent polar drift. Its transmitters are officially dark, yet the solar panels still trickle charge into a forgotten auxiliary circuit. One afternoon, that circuit crosses the threshold of a threshold, a single line of 1990s code, written in assembly and never patched, wakes to the sound of the girl's silence. The satellite begins to record the negative space. No voice, no data, just the shape of the gap, storing it as raw voltage in a 2-meter buffer that engineers assumed would never fill. Every 97 minutes, the buffer empties into the void, but not before a ham operator in Reykjavik, tinkering with a salvaged S-band antenna, notices a burst of perfectly uniform static 3,000 seconds long, riding the old weather frequency. He timestamps it, shares it, and a Nordic open science collective starts tracking the GOST packet. Within weeks they confirm the pattern. Always 30 seconds, always after the Navajo or Saginaw transmission ends. A new constellation is born, not of metal, but of absence. Down on Earth, the armor, now partially unstitched, begins to leak value. Hedge funds that went long on outrage futures, a derivative whose payoff spiked with each viral congressional clip, watch the volatility curve flatten. The algo notices fewer 15-minute windows in which a single clip can achieve 2x baseline engagement. Analysts blame context fatigue, but the quants discover something stranger. The half-life of outrage is inversely correlated with the number of analog silence packets circulating on unregistered frequencies. They can't parse the silence itself. There's no signal to scrape. So they proxy it by counting crank radio sales on eBay. The correlation coefficient is 0.87. A junior trader drafts a private memo titled "The Silence Arbitrage," arguing that any asset whose valuation depends on continuous outrage is now systematically overpriced. The memo is printed, hand-delivered, and locked in a Manhattan vault, whose combination is known by 3 people who still use mini-discs for voice notes. Short positions are taken, quietly, in the same week that Congress authorizes an additional $600 million for civic engagement infrastructure. The market, sensing the leak, begins to price the antibodies. The satellite, meanwhile, keeps logging silence. After 11 months, the buffer finally wraps. The oldest packet is overwritten, but not before a University of Tromsø grad student downloads the entire loop. 14,592 entries, each 30 seconds of null data, amounting to 4.86 hours of recorded absence, perhaps the only asset in the digital universe whose value increases the moment it is deleted. She burns the file onto a gold-layered CDR, labels it the first collectible of the negative economy, and mails it to the Slow Media Archive with no return address. The disk is too reflective to scan. It can only be held. When the historian places it on the table, the overhead LEDs bounce a perfect circle of light onto the ceiling, a silent projection that moves with every breath in the room. Visitors start timing their inhalations to the circle's sway, unconsciously synchronizing with a satellite they will never see, orbiting above a girl they will never meet, who once carried a square of paper across 3 counties just to prove that words could be longer than a thumb. In Brussels, the analyst who footnoted unmetered civic time watches the CDR's spectrogram on a live stream. She realizes the EU's downgrade protocol has been looking at the wrong axis. Instead of throttling content, regulators should have been metering silence, issuing tradable credits for every second of broadcast quiet, redeemable against future disinformation surges. She drafts a new annex, the silence quota. Every platform above 45 million users must host 0.07% of dead air per day, algorithmically inserted, non-skippable, and cryptographically verifiable as no signal. The proposal is laughed out of committee until a Luxembourgish MAP, former investment banker, recognizes the arbitrage. He tables an amendment to bundle silence credits with carbon offsets. Companies could meet both ESG and digital safety mandates by purchasing quiet tons. The price discovery mechanism is elegant. The more outrage on me line, the higher the spot price of silence. For the first time, the market assigns a dollar value to absence itself. Trades open on the Frankfurt Bourse under the ticker ABSNT. Within 6 hours, the price of 30 seconds of verified silence hits 12.40, more than the average CPM of a pre-roll political ad. The girl in Saginaw, now 17, hears about ABSNT on a crackling shortwave newscast. She laughs, an unrecorded, unquantified sound, then keys her mic and transmits exactly 30 seconds of dead air, followed by her call sign. Across the Atlantic, a Frankfurt terminal registers the packet, timestamps it, and mints an NFT whose metadata is the SHA-256 hash of the satellite's null attitude buffer. The token sells for $12.40 within 45 seconds. The girl has unintentionally become a commodity producer, mining silence on a crank radio. She does not cash out. Instead, she mails the private key, handwritten on the same folded square that once carried the Omar transcript, to the slow media archive. The historian places the paper inside the fireproof cabinet, next to the index card that reads, "Maybe the loop only stops when you stop trying to win it." The value of ABSNT spikes, a physical private key, locked in an analog vault, backed by unrecorded laughter. Analysts label it the first non-fungible absence backed by both orbital and terrestrial silence. No one can short it because no one can prove it exists. Above Earth, the satellite's buffer wraps again. This time, the overwrite coincides with a coronal mass ejection that scrambles the old weatherbird's last functioning circuit. The ghost packet stops. Reykjavik notices the absence of absence. Traders notice the absence of new silence tokens. ABSENT price doubles, then triples, then collapses when investors realize the satellite can no longer verify supply. The market has priced a void, and the void has gone dark. Panic selling triggers circuit breakers. For one surreal hour, the Frankfurt Bourse halts all trading in silence. When it reopens, the exchange requires future silence credits to be dual-stamped. One cryptographic signature from orbit, one from an earthbound analog archive. The only archive that qualifies is the slow media cabinet in the Library of Congress, whose contents are physically inaccessible, unreadable, and unburnt. ABSNE becomes a perpetual futures contract whose underlying can never be delivered, an asset that functions only as long as it remains locked away. The girl's laughter, still unrecorded, now underwrites a trillion-euro derivatives market that cannot be settled without destroying itself. Down in the mahogany console room, the teenager and the historian listen to the sudden cessation of ghost packets. They understand that the antibodies have evolved into something the spectacle cannot metabolize, a commodity whose value evaporates the moment it is consumed. They lock the cabinet, swallow the key, literally, an old magician's trick, and walk out of the building without writing the report. The library's security cameras capture two silhouettes fading into the pre-dawn fog. The footage is automatically uploaded to a server farm in Northern Virginia, but no algorithm flags it as content. There is no face, no voice, no signal, only absence walking away. Years later, a child who has never seen a push notification will find a rusted crank radio in a flooded church basement, next to a sealed envelope labeled "Open in Silence." Inside, a folded square of paper bearing a SHA-256 hash, a mini-disc labeled 217 plus 30, and a single line inked in shaky cursive. The armor was never metal. It was our fear of quiet. The child will turn the crank, hear nothing, and keep turning, because the absence tastes like truth, because the silence stretches longer than any thumb, because somewhere above, a dead satellite still orbits, its buffer empty, its absence now the only asset left whose value increases the moment you realize you can never own it. Only carry it, like breath, like weight, like the next unclipped second that has not yet been named.